The rapid spread of smartphones has completely changed the way we record our everyday lives. Almost every moment, whether we are traveling to faraway places or enjoying a peaceful hike through the woods, can now be captured instantly. These devices have become constant companions, always ready to document anything remarkable that happens. Yet this endless urge to film has also meant that more and more disasters are being recorded in real time, including the final, tragic moments of people's lives. Hit that like button and subscribe right now, because in today's episode we are going to examine 3 chilling cases in which individuals were caught on camera being fatally mauled by deadly animals. Welcome to Final Affliction. As the war in Ukraine continued to rage, 23-year-old Russian Vladimir Papov made a life-changing decision. He would leave his homeland. He had no desire to be forced into military service, and his father, Yuri, fully supported him. Neither man wanted Vladimir to risk his life on the battlefield. So the two of them packed up and moved to Egypt, leaving behind Vladimir's mother, who stayed at the family home in Balashika near Moscow, and his girlfriend, Anastasia. They settled along Egypt's beautiful Red Sea coast, hoping to build a quiet new life. Vladimir quickly found remote work as an IT consultant, which allowed him to earn a living from the comfort of his own home. For a while, everything seemed peaceful and promising for the young man and his father. But tragedy was waiting just around the corner. On the 8th of June 2023, only a few months after their arrival in Egypt, Yuri and Vladimir decided to take a walk down to the sea beside the Dream Beach Hotel in the Egyptian resort town of Hurghada. This picturesque coastal town stretches for nearly 30 kilometers along the Red Sea shoreline. The scenery is breathtaking. Long stretches of white and golden sand meet crystal-clear turquoise waters. Luxury yachts and motorboats bob gently just offshore, while holidaymakers relax on sunbeds, soaking up the warm sun. Vladimir felt as though he had discovered paradise. He had chosen a truly stunning place to start over. That fateful day, he stepped into the inviting water for what would become his final swim. The sea was calm and welcoming, the air pleasantly warm, and the water refreshingly cool. He swam confidently outward from the beach, staying within the designated safe swimming zone. Several other bathers were enjoying the water at the same time, adding to the relaxed atmosphere. Then, without warning, a shout pierced the air. Someone had spotted something terrifying. Every swimmer's worst nightmare was unfolding right before their eyes. The unmistakable shape of a dorsal fin slicing through the surface. Panic erupted instantly. Everyone began swimming frantically toward the shore. As Vladimir turned to swim back, he suddenly felt a sharp, powerful tug on his leg and let out a cry of agony. What followed was one of the most devastating and shocking attacks imaginable. Rarely is an animal attack witnessed by hundreds of people from such a short distance, but that is exactly what happened to Vladimir. As his cries echoed across the water, people stood up from their sunbeds and stared in horror. Only 20 feet from the beach, Vladimir was being violently thrashed around by an enormous shark. For a brief moment, the shark released him, and onlookers caught a clear, terrifying glimpse of the massive dorsal fin circling the young man. Then he was dragged underwater once more. He fought desperately, pushing at the shark with his hands, but the animal was far too agile, too fast, and far too powerful. The water erupted into a chaotic frenzy of crashing waves and bubbling foam as Vladimir was pulled out of sight. The large gray body of the shark arched powerfully out of the sea. Vladimir's legs could be seen kicking wildly in the air above the surface as he was tumbled and spun upside down like clothes in a washing machine. He resurfaced again, dazed and disoriented, and tried to make a few desperate strokes toward the shore. The beach was agonizingly close, yet he was surrounded by a spreading cloud of his own blood that poured into the Red Sea. His body language showed pure terror and uncertainty. He could see his father standing on dry land and the growing crowd gathered at the water's edge, but no one could reach him in time. "Papa!" he cried out in desperation. "Help me!" But there was nothing Yuri could do. Lifeguards immediately launched a rescue boat and sped toward Vladimir as he bobbed helplessly in the water. For a few heart-stopping seconds, he floated there. Then the enormous shadow of the shark reappeared directly beneath him. The predator was not finished. Its jaws opened wide as it surged upward from below, seized Vladimir around his torso, and dived deep underwater with the young Russian still clamped in its mouth. Witnesses watched in horror as Vladimir's limp and lifeless body resurfaced again and again while the shark continued to feed. For the next 2 hours, the shark tormented everyone present, repeatedly pulling and tugging at Vladimir's remains in full view of the crowded beach. It was a living nightmare for every person who saw it. A lifeguard named Mohammed bravely swam toward Vladimir and another tourist who was still in the water. He could see that the sea around Vladimir was thick with blood. As he lifted the man's arm, Mohammed realized the hand was missing. When he tried to support the body, he discovered in horror that the shark had torn Vladimir's head clean off. The creature had also ripped open the man's chest and taken massive bites from his abdomen. It was the most horrifying sight Mohammed had ever witnessed. It was obvious that Vladimir had already died. So Mohammed turned his attention to the shocked tourist woman swimming nearby. She was barely able to move from fear. He grabbed her under the arms and pulled her safely back to shore, where beachgoers comforted and cared for her. Once the shark had finally had its fill, authorities managed to capture it. They deployed long nets behind speedboats and encircled the predator until it was trapped and dragged onto the beach. It turned out to be an enormous tiger shark measuring 10 feet in length. Its distinctive striped markings were clearly visible across its powerful body as it was pulled onto the sand. Its fate was now sealed. A large crowd gathered to stare at the killer shark. Then, in a surge of anger and grief, people began beating it mercilessly with metal bars and wooden sticks. The shark thrashed desperately on dry land, flapping its tail and writhing in a futile attempt to return to the water. After both brutal deaths, the tiger shark was cut open. Inside its stomach were some of Vladimir's remains, a gruesome discovery that included his head and several other body parts. But another finding may have explained the shark's extreme aggression. The female tiger shark was pregnant. Tiger sharks carry their eggs internally, and the babies develop inside the mother until they are ready to be born, sometimes as long as 16 months later. Marine expert and fellow Russian Dmitry Orlov offered his own theory about why the shark had attacked Vladimir so ferociously. He believed the shark was heavily pregnant and overloaded, making her usual fast-moving prey too difficult to catch. Humans, being relatively slow and defenseless in the water, would have been much easier targets. However, other experts have suggested that rising sea temperatures in the Red Sea may have influenced the shark's behavior, possibly driving it closer to shore or toward the Gulf of Suez in search of cooler waters. The year before Vladimir's death, a tiger shark had attacked 2 female tourists, an Austrian and a Romanian, in the exact same location, raising further questions about whether this particular shark had grown accustomed to human presence. After the attack, Yuri spoke publicly about his son's death. Remarkably, he held no grudge against the Egyptian government and even described the tragedy as Vladimir's destiny to be eaten by the shark, an unusual but perhaps comforting way to process such an unimaginable loss. Back in Russia, Vladimir's mother learned of the horrific events. Her son had moved to Egypt specifically to avoid an early death in war, yet now his whole future had been stolen in the most brutal way possible. After a thorough forensic examination of Vladimir's remains, Yuri was given permission to cremate his son and bring the ashes home to Russia for a final resting place. As for the shark, authorities decided to preserve the massive specimen for educational purposes. A team of 5 expert embalmers worked meticulously to mummify the shark so it could be displayed in a local museum, serving as a stark reminder of the dangers lurking in the Red Sea. The Red Sea has been plagued by shark attacks for decades. Overfishing has depleted the shark's natural prey, such as large tuna, forcing these incredible predators to seek other food sources closer to shore. This makes future attacks even more likely. Perhaps the Red Sea resorts should consider installing protective shark nets, a method that has proven effective in other parts of the world. Immediately after Vladimir's death, the beaches were closed and the sea emptied as tourists fled the area. Yet only a couple of days later, the local government declared the water safe again. Speedboats and safety divers patrolled the coastline to reassure visitors and watch for danger. But the question remains, how long will it be before people forget this tragedy? How long before another innocent swimmer meets their terrifying final affliction? The grizzly bear is a fierce and formidable predator that should be avoided at all costs. These powerful animals have been responsible for more than 180 human deaths in recent years. Although bear attacks are actually quite rare, they usually occur only when the bear is protecting food, cubs, or territory. Most of the time, grizzlies prefer to steer clear of humans altogether. Yet some people deliberately seek them out and venture deep into their domain. One of the most infamous examples is Timothy Treadwell, known to the world as the Grizzly Man. Even as a child, Timothy had always been unusually fond of animals. He once kept a pet squirrel and formed strong bonds with wildlife. In his adolescence, while studying bears in Alaska, he had his first close encounter with a wild grizzly. That moment changed everything. He realized his true calling in life. He later admitted that he had lost his way during college, falling into alcoholism and drug abuse and nearly overdosing on heroin in the late 1980s. That brush with death became the catalyst that drove him to seek out bears and make them his lifelong passion. For 13 years he lived among them, studying their behavior and eventually writing a book titled Among Grizzlies, Living with Wild Bears in Alaska. Over time, the bears grew accustomed to his presence. He was able to touch them and even play gently with their cubs. In his own words, he believed he had developed a relationship built on mutual trust and respect. After the book's release, Timothy gained recognition in television and environmental circles. He traveled across the United States giving talks at schools and appeared on numerous TV shows to share his extraordinary experiences. Together with his co-worker Jewel Palavac, he founded the charity Grizzly People, dedicated to protecting grizzly bears and their habitat. Yet his work was controversial from the beginning. The National Park Service strongly disapproved of his actions, arguing that he was disrupting the bear's natural behavior and putting himself in extreme danger. He also led unauthorized tours that brought visitors dangerously close to the animals, something strictly forbidden by park regulations. Many considered him reckless because he refused to use electric fences around his camps or carry bear spray, insisting that the bears would never harm him because of the special bond they shared. Despite all the warnings, Timothy continued his close interactions with the grizzlies. He would soon discover, in the most horrifying way possible, that such a relationship could be shattered in an instant. In October 2003, Timothy and his girlfriend Amy Huguenot traveled to Katmai National Park in Alaska. Park rangers had warned them that camping in the area at that time of year was extremely dangerous. Food was scarce, and the bears were preparing for winter by eating anything they could find to build fat reserves for hibernation. Timothy's goal was to check on one of his favorite female brown bears and make sure she was healthy and ready for the long winter. Amy was deeply reluctant. She was terrified of bears and simply wanted to go home. But she stayed because she knew how important the animals were to the man she loved. Throughout the trip, they tracked several bears, but Timothy soon realized that most of the ones familiar with him had already gone into hibernation. The bears now around them were unfamiliar, which made him slightly uneasy. Still, he decided to stay and set up camp with Amy. On October 5th, the couple was setting up their video camera to film more footage of the bears. The camera was recording audio, but the lens cap was still on, so there was no visual record. Soft rain could be heard in the background as Amy worked inside the tent. Suddenly, she called out to Timothy, asking if he was still outside because she could not hear him. Then the screaming began. Timothy was yelling for Amy to get out of the tent and run. He was being torn apart by a large 28-year-old male grizzly. Amy opened the tent flap and screamed at him to play dead, hoping it would make the bear leave. For a brief moment, it seemed to work. The pair could be heard discussing whether the bear had truly gone. In that short window, Amy apparently approached Timothy to tend to his wounds. But the bear returned almost immediately and attacked again. Timothy began to panic, realizing that playing dead would no longer save him. He begged Amy to hit the bear with something. She grabbed a frying pan and struck the animal on the head. The bear released Timothy's head and instead bit into his thigh, dragging him away from the tent. Covered in blood and knowing he had no chance of survival, Timothy shouted for Amy to run and save herself. Although he was in terrible pain, he remained fully conscious throughout the attack, unlike many victims who go into shock. He was eaten alive by the very animal he had loved and trusted so deeply. The bear made only sporadic growls and grunts. The dominant sounds on the tape were Timothy's desperate screams of agony and the dull, sickening noise of his body being dragged across the dirt away from camp. Tragically, Amy never fled. She was frozen in fear and shock, already terrified of bears and now witnessing her worst nightmare come true. She was not familiar with the remote area and had no idea how to find her way back to civilization. On the recording, her screams suddenly erupted, raw and animal-like, as she realized the full horror of what had happened and the danger she now faced. Those screams unfortunately drew the bear straight back to her. It finished the job, mauling Amy to death as well. The next morning, air taxi pilot Willie Fulton arrived at Kaflia Lake to fly the couple out. He looked around and thought he saw Timothy shaking a tarp to get his attention. But when he called out, there was no reply. He decided to hike up the path but quickly turned back, sensing something was terribly wrong. Once back at his plane, he glanced behind him and felt his blood run cold. Through the fog, a large, menacing brown bear was staring directly at him just off the path he had walked. He climbed quickly into the plane and revved the engine, hoping the noise would scare the bear away so Timothy and Amy could pass safely. As he circled the campsite 15 or 20 times, he kept watching the bear. It was slowly eating something. That was when he realized with horror that the bear was feeding on a human rib cage. Sickened, he radioed the park rangers and urged them to investigate, believing something terrible had happened to the couple. A group of rangers arrived and hiked toward the campsite with Willie guiding them from the air. They spotted a couple of bears along the way, but the animals ignored them and they continued. Suddenly, one ranger shouted, "Bear!" and pointed to an animal only 20 feet away. They yelled loudly to scare it off, but it soon became clear the bear was not threatened and was actually stalking them. The rangers opened fire, shooting a total of 21 rounds between them until the bear was dead. They pressed on to the campsite and found both tents collapsed and torn, with a large pile of mud and dirt heaped at the entrance. When they moved the mud aside, they discovered Amy's body. Her fingers were pushing up through the dirt. She had been buried by the bear as a food cache for winter. Aside from that gruesome detail, she looked almost peacefully asleep, except for the horrifying reality that she had been almost entirely eaten. The rangers were shaken but continued searching for Timothy. Their hopes of finding him alive were fading fast. They combed the surrounding forest and found pieces of him scattered everywhere. His head was discovered still attached to a piece of spine, frozen in a horrific grimace that captured the agony of his final moments. His right arm and hand lay nearby, his watch still strapped to the wrist. It was a scene of unimaginable horror. While the rangers were recovering the bodies, a smaller 3-year-old bear approached them from about 30 feet away, clearly stalking the team. It was shot immediately. The rangers were taking no chances. Once Timothy and Amy's remains had been removed, the large bear's body was sent for necropsy. The examination confirmed human remains and clothing inside its stomach, proving it was the animal that had killed and eaten the couple. The younger bear had already been cannibalized by other bears, so it will never be known whether it played any role in the deaths. In the end, Timothy and Amy's story stands as a tragic reminder to respect wild animals and give them the space they deserve. No matter how strong a bond may seem, you can never truly know what might happen, or what else might be waiting in the forest, ready to bring you to your horrifying final affliction. It was a quiet Sunday, November 29, 1964. While most people were enjoying a relaxing day off, Henry Borse and his friends had something far more adventurous in mind. Henry was no ordinary weekend warrior. He was a passionate underwater photographer and the lead saxophonist in a Melbourne-based rock and roll band. It seemed he could do it all. When Henry had an idea, nobody could talk him out of it. Not even his girlfriend, Jill Ratcliffe. So when he planned a trip to the ocean, it was never going to be a simple day at the beach. Instead, he intended to film seals on a remote ancient island off the coast of Victoria and go spearfishing in the surrounding waters. On that typical Sunday, Henry and his team prepared to visit Lady Julia Percy Island, a volcanic island located 22 kilometers from Port Fairy. Formed some 7 million years ago by violent underwater eruptions, the island had separated from the Australian mainland when the continent drifted away from Antarctica. The waters around it are 30 to 50 meters deep, with strong waves crashing against sharp rocks. The southwest end features vertical cliffs, rocky coves, shore platforms, and mysterious ancient sea caves filled with oceanic creatures. Lady Julia Percy Island is also home to the largest breeding colony of Australian fur seals, as well as rare seabirds found nowhere else. Yet where there are fur seals, there are also their natural predators, great white sharks. Unbeknownst to Henry and his friends, this would be the day that would change their lives forever. Members of the Victorian Aqualung Club, to which Henry belonged, along with divers from the Port Fairy Manta Skin Diving Club, left the Moyne River Wharf aboard a commercial shark fishing boat. Henry, the filmmaker, wore a black hooded wetsuit, standard gear in those days. The two groups eventually reached the shores of Lady Julia Percy Island and began exploring and filming. They anchored the boat a few meters offshore. While preparing to dive, Henry and his friends were casually discussing a terrifying local legend. It was not the usual conversation one might expect right before entering the ocean, but the story was about a massive great white shark known as Big Ben that supposedly roamed these waters. Although most sea monster tales are exaggerated, this one was easier to believe given the thousands of fur seals visible as far as the eye could see. Put a man on a boat in the middle of the ocean near a remote island teeming with seals, and you have the perfect recipe for imagining the most monstrous creature alive. Locals claimed Big Ben was at least 20 feet long and swore they had the scars to prove his existence. To Henry, however, the tale simply sounded like another exciting opportunity to add to his portfolio. At around 12:45 p.m., Henry entered the water and swam into the deeper areas. He filmed for about an hour, then returned to the boat satisfied with the first roll of film. He decided to go back in for more footage, this time accompanied by Dietmar and Fred, both armed with short-handled spears. No one could have predicted how dramatically this second dive would end. The three friends performed a free dive and soon found a group of seals rolling playfully in the waves. Henry immediately began filming, focusing on a large bull seal. Suddenly, the seals scattered and the energetic water became eerily still. Something was wrong, but the poor visibility made it impossible to see what was approaching. They descended another 10 meters and hugged the bottom, still unable to locate the seals. Realizing they needed to surface, Henry broke through first. The instant his head emerged, an incredible force slammed into him like a freight train. Before he could even process what was happening, he knew exactly what had attacked him. He threw his arms into the air to signal the others and screamed at the top of his lungs, "Shark!" In the next split second, he was violently torn through the water. The great white Big Ben had latched onto his leg and shook him like a dog shaking an old slipper. Henry desperately tried to reach for the shark's eyes, but its large snout kept getting in the way. He felt the searing pain of the shark's teeth sinking deep into his calf as he frantically scraped his hand across its face. Beyond the pain, a more immediate danger loomed. Henry was drowning. He had been holding his breath for roughly 45 seconds while the onslaught continued. He was suffocating as the massive creature tugged and rolled him from side to side. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the tugging and rolling stopped. Henry sensed a fleeting moment of peace. He swam desperately toward the surface and burst through, gasping for air. He reached down to his left leg and realized with horror that it was gone. The shark had torn it clean away. Despite the immense shock, Henry somehow kept his focus. Dietmar and Fred reached him, but the danger was not over. The shark returned for more, having tasted blood and now eager for another bite. The creature came at Henry at least 5 separate times. Each time, Dietmar and Fred fought it off bravely with their small hand spears. The spears became bent and warped from the violent struggle. Eventually, the dive boat sped toward the commotion. Jill grabbed the safety line and helped haul Henry aboard. He immediately received first aid as blood poured from the terrible wound. The other divers brought him to the center of the boat and swiftly applied a tourniquet. Even though some team members were still on the island, Henry's condition was far more urgent. The captain decided to head straight for the hospital and return for the others later. He radioed ahead for emergency help and a blood transfusion. When they reached Port Fairy, an ambulance was already waiting with several liters of blood. According to the doctor, Henry had lost 3.5 liters of blood during the attack. He was rushed to Warrnambool Hospital. 2 main theories emerged about why the shark had attacked. According to Dietmar, Henry had been petting a dog on the beach and aboard the boat, and the dog's scent may have lingered on him, triggering the shark. Another theory suggested that Henry's wetsuit had yellow markings. Experts and 2 Australian universities have noted that while sharks are colorblind, they are highly sensitive to contrasting objects in murky water. The bright yellow against the dark sea could have stood out sharply and attracted the great white. Many people argue that the chances of being attacked are actually lower than the risk of being lost at sea, since bright colors help rescue teams spot swimmers. Nevertheless, Henry was attacked viciously despite being surrounded by thousands of seals. He was incredibly lucky to survive. Eventually, Henry made a full recovery and was back in the water within a few weeks. In 1968, he released a documentary called Savage Shadow, which included actual footage of the attack along with a dramatic reenactment. In a later interview, he expressed no grudge against the shark. To him, the animal had simply been acting according to its nature. He considered himself fortunate to have been surrounded by skilled and trained divers. Losing his leg, he believed, had actually helped free him from the shark's grasp. Unlike most great white attacks, which involve a single test bite, this shark had returned 5 times with clear intent to eat him alive. If it had not been for the heroic efforts of his friends, Henry would certainly have met his unfortunate final affliction.